The home front, North and South. The Civil War changed the lives for civilians as well as those of soldiers. The Civil War changed the lives of the soldiers involved. However, civilians are just people, you guys, like you and me, people who aren't in the war, just people who live there. However, civilians on both sides were also caught up in and forever changed by the war. Women had to feed and care for families while taking over the duties that their husbands had before the war. People on the home front had to deal with inflation, lack of supplies, sickness, and long times with no news of their loved ones. Many lived in areas where the armies fought or marched through. Okay, so inflation is prices going up, lack of supplies, not having enough stuff. And obviously sickness and not knowing what's going on with the loved ones. All right, so let's talk about the North. The North started the Civil War with big advantages over the South, especially in terms of manufacturing power, food supplies, and number of people. Rail networks of more than 22,000 miles carried shipments of food and equipment from farms to cities. 20 million people, more than a fifth of them recent immigrants, provided a large pool of soldiers and of workers for farms and factories. In 1860, the North had 9 of the 10 largest cities. In the South, only New Orleans, Louisiana made the list. New York City had reached a population of 1 million. Industry in the northern cities consisted of manufacturing, cloth milling, shipping, and businesses such as stores, financial firms, and professionals such as doctors and lawyers. Okay, so when the war first started, we talked about this. It looked like the North had a big advantage over the South. They had manufacturing plants, which means they made things. They farmed, and they had a lot of food because they used machines to help farm. They also had a lot of people, and they had their railroads. Okay, so they had more people. Some families became wealthy during the war. They usually were in business that manufactured war supplies. Accusations flew of poorly made supplies being sent to the army at exuberant prices, but these people continued to build their wealth. Companies making munitions, uniforms, harness equipment, and boots could charge the government whatever price they wanted because the demand was so great. Okay, so the people who made the supplies for war, the uniforms, the guns, the equipment, the boots, all that stuff, because it was needed, they could raise the price up. They could charge whatever they wanted. Exuberant means high. Middle class family would have a father employed in one of the city's businesses. The family would own its home, probably a row house, and likely have 1 or 2 servants. The mother would care for the children and elderly in the family, shop for food and necessities, and oversee the servants. Once the war began, the mother might have to run the family business on top of her other duties or manage the household on savings and the father's army pay. All right, so in the middle class family, the father went to work and the mother ran the house. She took care of the elderly, she shopped, she cooked, she cleaned. She also had servants who would cook and clean for them. So maybe she didn't cook too much, but she shopped for the food and she took care of the children and the elderly. In 1863, more than half of New York's population lived in tenements. Most were recent immigrants who squeezed whole families of 8 to 10 people into 1 or 2 rooms. They worked at whatever low-paying jobs they could find. The men from the tenements enlisted in the army for substantially better pay of $13 a month, leaving the women behind to care for the family. Some women and many children worked in the factories and cloth mills, often 12 hours a day at dangerous jobs. Women worked in munitions factories, making the cartridges needed for the armies. Women sewing at home might make less than $2 a week, working 14 hours a day. The pay for factory workers would barely cover food and rent for a family, even if children were working and adding their wages to the family funds. Okay, so there were a lot of immigrants in 1863. A lot of them were living together in large groups, like 8 to 10 people in 1 or 2 rooms. The men would go to war because they would get $13 a month. If you worked in a factory, you made not a whole lot of money. Women and children worked there. If they sewed from home, they would sometimes make like $2 a week. So if there's 4 weeks in a month, that's $8 a month. That's not very much money. Imagine living on that now. Women who did not have to run businesses or work banded together in sewing circles and groups to make bandages and clothing for the troops. A group in Boston turned out 1,000 shirts in one day. Some women worked in such groups while others sewed or knitted as they found time from their home chores. They sent boxes of clothing to troops on the front lines. Okay, so some women who had time, who didn't have to work, um, they got together and formed a group and made shirts and clothing for the troops and sent them out there, kind of like a care box. Single women joined the likes of Dorothea Dix and Clara Barton and became nurses for the wounded. Lucia May Alcott worked as a nurse in a military hospital. These women proved to the skeptical army doctors that they had the courage and ability to be nurses under terrible conditions. Although the Union had large cities, more than half of the population lived on farms. The farms varied in size from small vegetable farms in the Northeast to large ranches in the West. Before the war, men worked in the fields, growing grain, potatoes, feed, and hay for animals, apples, and vegetables. A hired hand might also work in the field and take meals and board with the family. Okay, so the Union had a lot of cities, um, but a large population of it was farm. We talked about that before. So before the war started, the men would actually work in the fields to grow all the food and help raise the animals. And their hired hands would work with them, and then the hired hands would usually just stay with the family or stay with them, which means board and eat with them. Mechanical equipment such as Cyrus McCormick's reaper became available and were introduced as labor-saving devices. As a result of such innovations, for example, in 1862, Union areas, including newly settled Western farms, produced more wheat than the whole country had in 1859. So a couple lessons ago, we talked about that, how the use of machines really enabled the North to plant large crops and produce more food at a quick rate. Farm women cared for the children and elderly and performed housekeeping chores such as sewing, weaving, spinning, preparing, and preserving food. They often were in charge of the garden and chickens. The more prosperous family might have a hired girl, usually from a neighboring farm, working on household chores for about $1.25 a day plus room and board. All right, so the women here, they took care of the children. They did house chores. When the men marched off to war, the women began managing farms in addition to their household duties. One woman wrote her husband that she had managed to plant corn and vegetables, but that rain had washed away much of the seed. She sold a pig and a cow to buy more seed and to hire help in planting while she cared for a sick child. Still, she was able to plant much less land than he had managed before the war. So when the men went off to the war, the men who we just talked about a couple paragraphs ago, who their job was working in the fields and planting them and taking care of them, the fields, now the women are having to do that since the men are gone. But they're still having to take care of their households and the children. So it became a lot of work for the women. In 1862, the Homestead Act was passed, allowing for people to receive 160 acres of land in the western part of the country in return for working the land for 5 years and making improvements such as building a barn and a house. The rush to the western territories began. Over the years of the war, more than 2.5 million acres were homesteaded. Okay, so 1862, a Homestead Act. It's basically a law, kind of. And it was saying that, okay, here, if you agree to take this 160 acres of land for 5 years, no, we'll give it to you, but you, in return, you have to work the land for 5 years. You have to make improvements, you have to build on it, you have to build a barn and a house, but you can have it. So a lot of people did that. It was worth it. So it helped to build up the land. The families who took up homesteading would travel west in wagon trains for the trip of about 500 miles. They chose land and filed on it. The first priority was breaking ground and planting crops. A small house would be built, usually of sod or possibly logs. Fuel was scarce, so many families burned buffalo chips. Okay, so the families that came to take advantage of this Homestead Act and being given 160 acres, they came, traveled by wagon. It was about a 500-mile trip. And they had to file for land. So they said, okay, I want to do it. And then it was looked over and the government said, yep, you can have it. And so then they had to start planting crops and build a house. Men worked long hours plowing the sod and planting. The first years of sod corn were small crops, but eventually the grain produced was enough to feed the North and to ship the excess to Europe. Some of these men did eventually go to war, but many stayed, proving up their homesteads and providing food for the North. The start of the war meant that items that had come from the South were cut off. For people in the North, tobacco, sugar, and cotton became very expensive and then impossible to buy. They stopped using these things, making substitutions as they could. For example, they raised more sheep for wool to replace the cotton not available from southern plantations, and honey replaced sugar. Okay, so we talked about this before. The Southerners, they grew cotton and tobacco. Those were like their main things. They also had sugar, and they would export them, which means ship out, and the northern states would buy them. Well, when the war started, um, all of that stopped. So the Northerners, could no longer really get tobacco or cotton or sugar because it was super, super expensive. So they found things to use instead. They used wool and they used taxes were raised to provide money for the war, and the government also printed money. This caused inflation, an overall increase in the North of about 80% over the course of the war. Necessary items such as food, clothing, and coal rose twice as fast as wages, causing strikes and strife between workers and employers. Eggs went from 15 to 25 cents a dozen, potatoes from $1.50 a bushel to $2.25, and people ate cheaper items to control their costs, and many, even in the cities, started home gardens to increase their food supply. In the Eastern Theater, most of the battles took place in the South. However, two large battles were fought in the North. In the late summer of 1862, Confederate forces invaded the Union, and on September 17, 1862, a battle erupted near Sharpsburg, Maryland. The Battle of Antietam, as it was called in the North, was the bloodiest single day in American history. The combined sides lost more than 22,000 men. Just 10 months later, the Confederates advanced into Union territory again. This time, the opposing forces met at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. A fierce three-day battle brought the highest casualties of the war, about 50,000 men from both sides. The fighting roared over and through the town, while the residents hunkered down whatever they could. Long after the armies had left, the townspeople nursed soldiers in blue and gray back to health. Okay, so this is just talking about two battles that took place in the North. We actually talked about these battles last week, the Battle of Antietam and the Battle of Gettysburg. They were both very bloody wars, and a lot of lives were left. However, the Union came out on top. The South. The citizens of the South faced many of the same hardships as those of the North. When men left to go to war, women took up their duties on top of their own. Supplies were short, inflation was much more rampant than in the North, and long weeks passed without word from soldiers on the front line. So just like in the North, the cost of things went up. They didn't hear from their loved ones, and it was just hard. Women had to take over more responsibilities. Only about 10% of the population of the South lived in cities, and the cities were smaller than those in the North. Many of the jobs were similar to those in the North: merchants, doctors, lawyers. Ports were busy shipping cotton around the world, and there were few factories. When the men went to war, the women took over businesses as much as they could. They also formed sewing and knitting groups and took on nursing duties, as did the women of the North. For the Southern women, supplies became even scarcer than in the North, and many struggled to feed their families. All right, so it was similar. The men left, the women had to take over in the North and the South. However, there was less supplies in the South, so it was very hard to feed families. As the war continued, many cities and towns in the South saw fighting firsthand. Atlanta, Savannah, Vicksburg, Petersburg, Richmond, and others all came under the guns of the Union. Only a tiny fraction of the population lived as plantation owners. Their wealth in slaves, land, and crops gave them great power. Before the war, the men supervised the many activities of the plantation, much like that of a small town. A plantation owner might have a manager in direct oversight of the slaves, but he decided the work to be done, crops to be planted and harvested, items to be repaired, etc. The women of the house supervised the house slaves as they cooked, cleaned, cared for the children, and tended the gardens. Women also entertained visitors who often came for weeks at a time. Once the war began, women did their best to take over the plantation duties. But as more slaves ran away and cotton could not be shipped due to the Union blockade, most women did what they could to grow food for their families. Many slaves ran away with advancing Union armies, but did not find much better treatment than they had as slaves. The slaves who stayed with their mistresses faced the same deprivations and hunger as the plantation owner families. Even more so than in the North, the vast majority of the population in the South lived on small farms. They might have one or two servants, but had few slaves. The men worked in the fields, cared for animals, and grew food for the family.